Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Dardashe. I'm Salem Barahmeh, the director of BIPD. Today, we're going to be joined by Farah Nabulsi, a Palestinian British filmmaker and human rights advocate, and her latest short film, The Present, was recently shortlisted for the Oscars. Farah, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How are you? How are things? I know you're based in London at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, like the rest of the world, dealing with this past year and the pandemic, but alhamdulillah, can't complain. Can't complain.
Good, alhamdulillah.
I've had an extraordinary year when it comes to the film. So
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk. I definitely want to talk about the film, but I want to also talk about your journey to filmmaking. So I wanted to start a bit to try to get to know you a bit more, and where did you grow up? What's your connection to Palestine, and what eventually brought you to this work?
yeah, so I was born, raised, educated in the UK, and my business background. I said my business, my educational and career background, if you like, professional background was in business and
Mm,
finance, and so I didn't study film. I didn't go to film school. I didn't work in the film industry. I'd been to Palestine many times as a child, and then around the first Intifada, 1988, we don't go back for many, many years, over 25 years. And then a few years ago, I went back for the first time as an adult. And growing up in the UK, I, I knew and know my blood is Palestinian. So there was never a question about that. And I was very up to date in many ways and aware of what was going on there. But when I went for the first time as an adult, I saw that reality with my
mm,
own two eyes. Yeah, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was really without sort of sounding like cheesy. It was a life changing trip for me, um, and I was overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed by what I saw in terms of, whether it's the wall plowing between Palestinian homes and lands and separating families, and the illegal settlements, these colonies on all the hilltops. You could look at a map of
mm,
these settlements, but it's not the same as driving past and seeing them, up on the hilltops. Um, the refugee camps, the separate road systems, the permit system. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So I kind of came back to what I consider my life of privilege, and I was writing therapeutically about what I had seen and what I had felt, and what I began to imagine as I naturally started to experience sort of or exercise my empathy by placing myself into the shoes of those suffering the injustice. And it was for personal reasons. And then a couple of years later, I was really struggling with this kind of development. I went back to Palestine a couple of times, and I felt frustrated. And I could even say to you, almost verging on depression. At the
mm,
time, I was running a business, but I really felt I needed to do more beyond charity, beyond sympathy. Um, and I came across my writings, and long story short, I decided to adapt those initial writings to short films. So I wrote and produced my first three short films, because I really felt compelled to tell these human stories and to express myself creatively. I think there was a very creative side to me as an individual that I wasn't necessarily tapping into. I've always loved film. I mean, my sister, she said, Farah, anyone who knew you as a teenager knows you're exactly where you're supposed to be now, which felt right when she said it. I mean, I had a huge smile on my face because I knew there was truth to what she was
mm,
saying. Um, and I've got the bug. I love what I'm doing, and I feel like I'm in so many ways not just getting to know my identity as a filmmaker, as a human being, as an artist better, but giving a voice to the silenced, and like I said, telling these human stories in a way where, for me, having been born and raised in the West, in the UK, it's the way I know how to tell stories, which is essentially more to Western audiences. And I think that a big reason why the situation in Palestine has been allowed to go on for so long and on such a scale, even though, we have truth and right and international law, for decades on our side, is because not enough people know about what's going on. This is separate to those who do know and are willfully blind, but I'm saying most people don't really know. And even when one does get to know about injustice in the world, you really have to empathize in order to ever want to take action. You really have to feel with another to be compelled to actually do something about it. And I just don't think there was enough, or has been enough, empathy. There might be sympathy, but not enough empathy with Palestinians and their plight and the oppression and all this injustice, decades and decades of what I call oceans of injustice, and that's the first name of my first film. And so for me, art is a means of speaking to people's hearts, and like I said, allows me to to express myself as well. So that's, I don't know, that's
No, absolutely, and it's such an important medium to be able to convey and share the story of Palestine with the world in a way that does touch into or tap into people's empathy. I agree with you. I think that's one thing that's extremely missing. I wanted to go back just to ask you a question. You mentioned as a child you visited Palestine often, and I was wondering if you at some point compared your memories as a child to when you were an adult visiting again for the first time, and what the difference was. Because I find myself, after spending about 9-10 years abroad, the way I digested everything obviously is different, but it shows you the gravity of the situation once you're or you understand it more. So I'm curious, for someone who wasn't able to go for so long, what was that evolution like from child Farah to adult Farah?
So when we used to go as children, when I used to go as a child with my siblings, that was, at a time when the military was even on the bridge as we would cross from Jordan, okay? And so I do have some very vivid memories. And my sister has even more vivid memories, my older sister and my older brother, where they have, quite traumatic detail of our experiences, going there and spending some time there. But again, you look at the world when you're a child through innocent child eyes. And so the majority of my memories were really happy memories, fresh made lemonade in Jama'in, or visiting my grandfather's, the family home, in Jama'in or in Burqa, my grandparents' home in Nablus, and just that being with family, cousins and uncles and aunts, and nice memories. Okay, but remembering and recalling that there was military, and there's a few incidents of stories which I can vividly remember, like where they would kind of come into Nablus and the military. So I have sort of good and bad, but overall they were happy memories.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas going back as an adult, you see reality for reality. So while certain dynamics have changed, you can cross the border and it's immigration, if you like, at the border, as opposed to, soldiers and things like that. You pick up on all the nuances, you pick up on the actual reality of the situation, and it's darker and it's more sinister, and you realize that it is a systematized industrial complex of control, and so while you can be in Nablus, for example, and no, you know, if you're in Nablus or in central Ramallah, so I don't mean on the outskirts, but in the, you could in many ways be none the wiser, you know, in that sense, unless of course you're there at a time where there is a lot of turbulence and incursions and things like that. But in general, you can get on with things. But as an adult, you become so acutely aware of you know, whether, so now, you know, you're looking at a watchtower and you're aware that, okay, you're being watched. The wall itself is overwhelming. Just the reality of it, it's just a different ball game, adult versus child. It just really is. And it struck me in a much more visceral way than I ever thought it would, because like I said, I thought I understood what was happening. I wasn't a sort of Palestinian born in England who'd kind of forgotten her roots. I was in Hyde Park as a teenager cycling for medical aid for Palestine. In my very British school, they would ask the students, which charity are we going to support? And I'd be like, we're going to do, you know, Welfare Association, or, you know, I don't, like, it was always, you know, so it was never far from my heart. Just you can't compare when you're there.
There is really nothing like it. And I always say that, you know, regardless of what your political background is, if you can stand at Kalandia and come out the other side, still holding on to those beliefs, you know, that's something else, because it really, I mean, after that, you really start questioning human nature and humanity and all these things. Was there a specific?
And you know what else I think? You know, people say, oh, you know, okay, Palestine, you know, okay, what about all these other issues in the world and all that? And I'm kind of like, part of me is, first of all, like, oh my God, my heart is with so much tragedy and injustice in the world, but there's only 24 hours in the day, 7 days a week, and, you know, 365 days a year. Now, if not a Palestinian for Palestine, then who is obviously, you know, a big question. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not nationalistic as a person. I'm not one of these people, whether it's British, Palestinian. I'm much more one of those, you know, call me a hippie if you like, but in terms of, I'm a citizen of the world. Like I really, for me, even if I wasn't Palestinian, the Palestinian cause, this struggle for self-determination, for freedom, for justice, for equality, these are universal rights, universal things to strive for, that as a human being, you know, we should be struggling for, regardless of who you are, where you are in the world, or, you know, and of course, anti-racism, anti-discrimination in all its shapes and forms all around the world. So I always say, like, if the situation there were to resolve and everything would be great, I'd like to think I'd be championing another cause in that sense. But at the end of the day, you know, you can't sort of just dilute yourself and be struggling for all causes all the time everywhere. I'd have a nervous breakdown and I wouldn't even laugh. Like, it's impossible. But the fact is, it is such a noble cause universally. If people really understand it, they would recognize in the 21st century, for this to be happening, a form of colonial secularism, and modern day, yes, ethnic cleansing, and how long it's been going on, and the aiding and abetting of governments and our tax monies, and you know, it's I think genuine, decent people would, just like happened in apartheid South Africa, when the world came to really recognize how unjust a situation is, then one would certainly rally for it. But anyway, I went off track here. I don't even know.
Absolutely, and I think this is, I mean, it ties us really well with the films you produce and the topics they take on. One thing I try to connect a lot with people about is the idea or the story of children being arrested, taken from their homes in the middle of the night, the trauma that causes. We recently, a few years back, did a small short documentary about the mental health of the children of Gaza, the generation that has never left, grew up under siege to the sound of drones and bombings, and have seen death and destruction. imagine the toll that takes on entire societies. And that was, you know, the idea of that was you know, the subject of one of your short films. It was the first one I've seen, by the way, and of your work.
Today They Took My Son. Yeah.
Yeah.
That film, I mean, that is based on a UNHCR document, a report about Palestinian children under Israeli military detention. And I mean, when I kind of look, I'm a mother, and I have 3 boys who, if I just think for a second, you know, had to undergo what so many Palestinian children have experienced and continue to experience, it just breaks the heart. So you don't have to, again, be Palestinian to understand and feel that. It's the universal parenthood, motherhood, fatherhood. And that report for me is truth. It's the reality. So that film was one of those films where it wasn't a choice to make. I had to make it. It was I you know, how do I say, like, it really was one of those films where you just have to make it because you're telling such a painful, true story that you need others to understand. And you know, and I felt like by doing it the way we did it, at least people can understand. It's different when you hand them a report and it's just dry and you say, hey, here you go, this happens to X number of children, and you know, then their hands are bound, and then this happens, and then that happens. And when, you know, it's and it's not just painful for the children. I mean, think about what that does to a parent. You know, it's almost like, God, so disturbing to me.
Yeah.
Just so disturbing.
I mean, that's the power of the medium, I think, because within the context of Palestine, we've been dehumanized for so long. We haven't been able to share our own stories. And so if you fully try to convey to people this experience through a report, I think that's only going to go so far, and turning it into a video or a film or short or an interactive display, whatever it is, I think is a better way, or a more effective way, I should say, of building that human empathy, reminding people. I feel like that's the hardest part of my job, is trying to remind people that we are also human, because it takes a toll on you trying to convince others that you deserve freedom and rights like everyone else. But yeah, for me, that issue and the issue of trauma, just the level of trauma that our entire society, whether it's trauma from being exiled or expelled, or whether it's the trauma of living under apartheid, and that's inherited as well. You know, it's I mean, scientifically, it's within our DNA, those memories and those feelings. And so it's
you know what I say. I mean, so you've got to remember, like, that. And when you say inherited traumas, and think of all the trauma and all the refugee camps, and you know, and it's insane. But I always, my empathy reaches out in every direction in the world. And I've always said, I've always understood the trauma of the Jewish people. Okay. And for centuries, you know, whether it's the pogroms, whether, you know, all this violence and hatred that has been placed on Jewish societies for a very, very long time. And then, of course, the Holocaust and all of that. And the trauma, and of course, this doesn't excuse what is happening in Palestine, but it explains to you a lot of the psychology of it. And it's so ironic that there is this, in many ways, the entire plot of Earth, where, you know, Palestine, historical Palestine, 48 Palestine, Israel, like this whole area is traumatized. And I always said, if you want the real solution, we should have 20,000 psychologists literally descend upon the land, like if every worldwide were to be like, I'm giving my psychotherapy sessions for free. I know this sounds ridiculous, but actually it's
No,
not, okay, because really that's where so much is rooted. They descend upon the land, they give free therapy for everyone, every Israeli, every Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, every Jew, everyone, for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. And you will realize that so much of the problem is that trauma, that current trauma, that inherited trauma that blinds so much of the understanding of each other, but also in many ways for Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society specifically, to recognize that Palestinians are not some kind of hateful people, somehow who are out to get them, with no reason and no sense or sensibility. And it's just like, instinctively just hateful people who hate. It's rubbish. But when they are veiled with their trauma, that's how they perceive us, and our trauma is what they don't realize is that it's perpetrating and it's making it worse and worse and worse in the way that we are being treated and dealt with, and that our Nakba, which is ongoing, is never recognized, is never atoned for, is never acknowledged. It makes it even worse. If only one could let them recognize that just seeing us as human beings and recognizing our humanity and saying, oh my God, I recognize what was done to you. And I am genuinely sorry for what was done to you. And we genuinely want to make amends. Even that, if it was genuine, how far that would go.
yeah.
It's so I personally think more than the 50% of this issue, let's go beyond the ideological birth mother of the state of Israel being a colonial Zionist enterprise. I'm saying I really think major part of this is the underlying psychological issues.
History is a vicious cycle of trauma that gets re-triggered all the time, and we are caught in that cycle, and we're the latest victims of that cycle. And I agree. I think if there's one public service announcement we can make throughout this episode is, please, therapy is great.
Yeah, if one could access it. I mean, when you think about it, I remember one article not too long ago regarding, of course, the PTSD in Gaza specifically, especially of children, and the fact that they don't actually have access to, you can count the number of actual therapists on your fingers kind of thing in Gaza, and they have no access to that kind of help. And of course it doesn't help if it's still ongoing. So it's not like, oh, we experienced a trauma, it's over, now we need to work through it. No, it's at any moment we're going to be inundated with that same trauma. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know how. We're continually living actually that trauma in so many other ways. How do you ever rise up from that? How do you ever get through that? And this is where it's so tragic. It's not like we even have access.
Yeah, and the terrible thing also slightly about within our society, it's therapy or seeing a therapist is still slightly taboo, right? Because they associate it with really negative notions of what that means. So not only is it not accessible, but it's also taboo, and that combination is no, it's not great. Speaking of trauma, I grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s. Those were my formative years. And so it was during the second Intifada. And one big thing that as an adult, the reason why I asked you the question about seeing something through a child's eyes versus an adult's eyes, is I could never move freely throughout the country. There's a lot of Palestine, historic Palestine, I've never seen until now. I remember the first time I went to Haifa was when I was 28, even though it's not too far away, 2-hour drive. And the wall, the checkpoints at their height were when I was still a teenager. And so, reading about the present and seeing the film and seeing how you captured the essence of the freedom of movement, but also the levels of humiliation that Palestinians go to just to be able to go a very short distance is very powerful. What made you take that issue on, and why did you want to make a film about it?
So with the present, I mean, when people ask me, what inspired you, I say, of course, it's in many ways based on my own personal experience at checkpoints, and of course, observing Palestinians at numerous checkpoints, so hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians at numerous checkpoints. I have personally deliberately gone through actually two very key checkpoints that Palestinians without cars would go through. So I've actually at 3 a.m. gone through the whole process, and until I get to a certain place and actually turned around and come back, just to even have that personal experience of what it is like even to be in the checkpoints that I wouldn't normally go through as a, as Farah, just, so I've even put myself in these situations to really feel and understand. And that's before I was a filmmaker. So it was just me saying, right, let me understand this more. And it's a story that is, I say, the seed of this particular story is me getting to know a young man in Hebron, Bil Khalil, who lives in Shuhada Street, in that area where, as you know, there's something like 800 settlers, bang in the heart of one of the biggest cities. If I'm not mistaken, Hebron is the biggest city in the world. Yeah. And so it's like 150,000 people, but for 800 settlers, they have a whole infrastructure of checkpoints and so forth. Anyway, this young man, he lives on a road where about 100 meters from his house is a checkpoint. And he has to go through that checkpoint no matter where he wants to go, what he wants to do, who he wants to see, what he wants to buy. And that, of course, includes his mother, who he lives with, and any other Palestinian in that area. They have to go through this. So I remember standing with him on the other side of the checkpoint at one point, and we were looking at this really monstrous checkpoint that actually, when I sketched the checkpoint for the present, I was basing it on that, with the turnstile and with the metal detector. That it was very similar to what he has to go through. And I said to him at the time, I was like, so you go through this, what, 2, 3, 4 times a day? He's like, yeah, I mean, unless I'm sitting at home all day, that, this is it. And the conversation went, okay, so if they've seen you earlier and they know you, like from, for that past week, 2 weeks, don't they kind of go, oh, okay, and he's like, well, first of all, Farah, there's this deliberate process. If you never leave these Israeli soldiers there long enough to get to know the people, because then they get a taste of your humanity. And so this system of making sure that they keep rotating so that, you don't have the same soldiers for long periods of time, where somehow a relationship could develop, or where somehow they could see your humanity, or you could see, what I mean? It's a very deliberate. And then on top of that, I was like, so if you had a couch, like you needed a new couch for your house, how do you bring it through? And he's like, yeah, if it doesn't fit, it doesn't go. I mean, and technically it's like, oh, okay. Then I even asked him, well, what if you needed new knives to cut your food with? Okay, so it's something that fits. And it's like, well, you try show up, to a checkpoint with a few kitchen, like, just to imagine these things were just blowing my mind. And I was like, he's like, well, technically you're supposed to take permit. I'm like, so you're going to ask for a permit to bring knives to your house, which is the most normal thing in the world to be able to bring. You need a cutting knife, you need a hammer, whatever you need in your home, like a normal human being, you should not have to take a permit for. But all of a sudden, these dynamics were just so warped. Just for everyday life on his road, his family home. So I just, that really, so this is where the sort of idea of the present was born, in terms of such a simple story. And yet it speaks volumes about such an absurd, humiliating cruel situation in reality.
Hebron is the darkest form or level of the ugliness of human nature I've ever seen. I mean, apartheid in your face.
Yeah, 101.
101. I was in South Africa a few years ago, and I went to Robben Island, and I met a former prisoner who gives tours, and I introduced myself, and he spoke to it, and he said to me, you know, the system in Palestine is much more oppressive and much more humiliating, and he used that word humiliating than anything we ever experienced in South Africa. And that to me really opened my eyes, because I was there and I was quite shaken by to learn about the context and the experience of Black South Africans. But to have him say that to me, I was like, wow, okay. So yeah,
Do you know what's interesting when you say that? So what I've concluded in some ways is that when I meet certain Westerners who are more passionate and more active and more involved with Palestinian human rights and freedom than many Palestinians, actually, many Arabs, and that I've come across, it's usually because they went and they saw in Palestine what's happening, right? And what contradicts pretty much what they kind of grown up being, led to believe, or the misperceptions or misconceptions that had been, provided to them. And it's so interesting because I think as a society, if you're in, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're in the oppression, you're in the eye of the storm in many ways, and you're and that inherited trauma, and you are, it's been decades, and you're born there and you live in there. Somehow, I suppose also as a coping mechanism, you have to just deal with it, right? It's survival mode. So in many ways, maybe you almost don't see how bad the situation is as one coming from the outside to see on the inside actually gets affected and impacted. It's almost, I don't want to call it, the word's not numb. It's more just it's a coping mechanism as well. And it's also just your reality. So you kind of come to terms with a reality. You're not happy with it. You're struggling with it. But outsiders coming in, it hits them in the face. It's like, bam. And in many ways, that's what happened to me, despite Isaiah, an outsider. Yes, I am an outsider, meaning having lived my whole life in the UK. So it really hit me like I said, a ton of bricks, shocking. And I think the same for Westerners. And I think even in that case, this man you've mentioned, he's experienced apartheid South Africa, but he can now look from the outside into Palestine and go, okay, hold on, I can see this is even worse. Yeah. And I just wonder, actually, and you tell me, I mean, Palestinians in Palestine, obviously they know this is just not right, not acceptable, not, but do you feel that there has been a sense of just not capitulation, but a little bit of like, okay, this has just been going on so long, we're exhausted, there's only so much we can do, and then a kind of...
Absolutely, I think...
And I'm sorry, and just to be clear, I'm not unaware of the deliberate process that Israel puts on Palestinians to have to just cope with life, that they don't even have time to even breathe, let alone they're trying to put food on the table here, Mm-hmm. So I get that, you keep them Palestinians so busy with just having to survive that there is no room to kind of figure out how to end it, if you get my meaning. But you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think so. The short answer is people crave normalcy. People crave normalcy. They've been denied it for a very long time. And the longer answer, and to put it into context, if you look at Palestinian society, it's majority under 30. So you look at people for the last 30 years. What have they experienced? The first Intifada, Oslo for 5-6 years, and then the second Intifada, and then which lasted 7 years. And then Gaza and everything that's happened till today. So only for a very short time did they have a semblance of normalcy. And then in the last 10 years, with the ease of lending and the introduction of a more advanced financial system, are starting, as you said, if you look at the different cities, the different metropoles, they have a fairly normal life where you don't see the occupation day to day. and that's a product of that. You know, you see cafes, you see restaurants, you see nice cars, you see people going to shop in a mall, and that's something that's something they've been denied for a very long time, and that's what they want.
But sorry, not to your train of thought, but here's the thing, that's the problem in some ways, is that because of these city centers that have kind of been allowed to flourish in that sense, it's very deliberate, of course, but when you go on the outskirts and in what is actually, you know, what do we say, areas B and C, but even just the outskirts, you kind of go, oh my God, there's all these forgotten people in so many ways, or and who in many ways, yes, it maybe is easy to put their hands up and move into the city centers, which would be exactly the bidding of the Israeli government, but aren't and don't, and they're the ones who are really suffering actually in this.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a bubble, and the levels of inequality are extreme. So the difference between the haves and the have-nots is increasing like everywhere else in the world. And so the people who probably drive the economy are only a few. And so even if you see the cities are bustling, unemployment rates are some of the highest in the world amongst youth, right? If not the highest in Gaza. So yes, even within the cities, even for the majority of society and those in the surrounding areas, everyone is facing a hard time. But the only coping mechanism they've been given is this system of debt. So every Palestinian is in severe debt, and it was a policy introduced by the PA with the support of the IMF and the World Bank, obviously the Israelis. Because if you create a middle class, that's going to pacify people from wanting to resist, especially a people that's exhausted. So a combination of these factors led us to where we are today, where young people are extremely apathetic about politics and political participation because they've been shut out and they've been put on a path where they've been craving normalcy in a system that keeps them in the hamster wheel of life. And it's a very difficult situation. It's a very, very dark situation, unfortunately.
Yes, that's very useful actually, having you describe it like that.
It's yeah true. So it's and there's no vision forward, and that's also something that is not giving people hope, because there's no political system to participate in, to have agency in creating your future. So you end up disenfranchised and marginalized, even though you represent the majority of society, you know. So young people are extremely frustrated, and the sad thing is, Farah, if you gave the opportunity for a young Palestinian to leave, they would. They would go and try to find a job and some normalcy, because that's what they seek. Because even our own haven't given them a reason to stay and resist or struggle, and that's also extremely sad.
Very sad.
Yeah. But I think it's important to keep telling the stories, and I think it's brilliant. I mean, when I saw the news that the president was shortlisted for an Oscar, you know, it was such a sense of pride and joy, and it really gives us fuel, right? And keeps us going. You know, amazing Palestinians creating amazing things that are putting us on the map, that are breaking these barriers of dehumanization that we're facing. And I think, you know, it's such a wonderful feat.
Thank you. Yeah, I think also the key for me in all this is, in some ways, like a proof of concept, you know, that actually, if we do tell our stories in a way that that people can understand, that it can resonate with, where they can empathize, and that we are also, you know, able to expose a reality, the truth, and rehumanize, or that in many ways the world wants to welcome that. They are open to understanding. They are interested and intrigued, not just with the present, with all my films when they were kind of released in at film festivals, and even more so with the present, always with Q&As, you know, it was always audiences, and these are international audiences, asking questions, directing majority of questions sometimes towards me versus, let's say, other filmmakers, because they are genuinely interested. They're genuinely, in many ways, confused as well, of like, well, but why is this happening, and okay, but where, and this is wonderful because it tells me that, yes, we need to tell our stories more, and there is audiences there that want to engage, and they'll even award us for it. I mean, the Oscar shortlist is great, phenomenal, and I didn't expect to get there, but I had high aspirations for the film. But it's the journey that got us there. I mean, the film has won over 25 jury and audience awards, having only been in around 40 festivals, very selective festivals, and they're all top tier festivals. And that told me it wasn't just even audiences, it was also the juries, and it wasn't juries, it was also the audiences. And just the reaction the film has had. I get emails and messages from people in Russia, in Japan, sending me messages. They've seen the film, and they're not people who necessarily, are familiar with Palestine, but now they are, and on that human level, and that tells me that I'm on the right track, but also that there's room to engage in that way, and that the world is ready and interested, because again, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago that might not have been the case, but we're in a world. I mean, you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and just we're in, especially after Trump, where suddenly you could see who's aligned with who, and all of a sudden it just became a lot clearer. This facade that has been perpetrated for many years suddenly became very clear, and I think the world is ready in that sense. And with, of course, technology placing this communications revolution into the palm of every single person nearly, essentially in the West, social media, transatlantic media, maybe it's just the right time as well. But I'm so happy that it was shortlisted, because the film itself is not sugarcoating anything. I didn't make a film to try and appease anyone. It was a passionate piece of art reflecting a cruel reality, and it gives me faith, it gives me hope, and I'm not holding my breath for a nomination. And yes, okay, we're down to 10 films, but I know what the other films are. There are some excellent films. I also know that some of the films have people in them and backing them and producing them that are like, they've been in the entertainment industry for a very long time. I'm not under any illusion, but if it were to be nominated, even more hope and faith in, again, because we know what the film shows and depicts.
Absolutely. If we're good at anything as a people, I think it's beautiful disruption. So I'm rooting for you, and I think you have an entire people rooting for you. And I think it already being shortlisted for the Oscars is such an incredible achievement, because it'll inspire another generation of Palestinian filmmakers. And this is what the question I wanted to end on. Your sister told you, Farah, at 16, we always, you ended up where you were supposed to be, and that's love. That's really lovely. So what advice or what message would you send to aspiring Palestinian filmmakers, especially here? There's so many who are incredibly creative and talented. What advice would you give them?
I think my advice is not necessarily just to filmmakers. So I think it's just to anyone who's trying to pursue something that they really want to do. For me, I would say that it has to be that whatever you're pursuing, let it be beyond the self, okay? Because that is when, where the passion, where you feel something so beyond yourself that you are driven in a way where it's no longer longer about the ego. It's no longer about the fear of failure, because you are driven by something beyond you, you know, something that is, it's so important to you. And so if you can find that thing, that is where you're going to be able to plow through the thick and the thin, and when things go wrong or things go right, and the world conspires because your intention was good, your intention was not selfish, but, you know, giving in that sense. Yeah. And that's how I feel about the entire journey I've been through, because I've always been very clear in my heart about the intentions of what I was doing, that it didn't matter to me what anyone thought or how hard it was going to be, or, you know what I mean? And I really feel that the universe does conspire with that. So I think find passion and good intent and go beyond the self, and things will open up. They will open up. Yeah, tenacity, you know, stick to it and push.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And I hope whoever's listening, you know, finds a source of inspiration in it. Farah, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on and speaking to you, and again, rooting all the way, not only for a nomination, but hopefully for an Oscar win.
Ah! Oh God! You know that we've shortlisted for the BAFTAs as well. Well, longlisted, which is the same. We're down to 10 for the British Academy Awards. So, yeah, let's hope. But I mean, now you killed it. What if it doesn't happen?
No. Again, it's already an amazing achievement, but let us root for both the BAFTA.
But thank you. No, thank you for having me. And yeah, I hope it's lent some inspiration.
Thank you, Farah.